Sarah Martinez adjusted her rifle scope one last time as the helicopter descended toward the Afghan mountains. The wind howled outside, carrying snow and ice that would make any normal person think twice about stepping foot in this frozen wasteland. But Sarah wasn't any normal person. She was one of the few female snipers in the military, and she had something to prove. The other soldiers in the helicopter looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and doubt. Most of them were Navy SEALs, elite warriors who had seen countless battles. They respected skill, but they also knew how harsh these mountains could be. The temperature outside was dropping to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and the mission would require staying still for hours in the cold. "She'll freeze up there," one of the SEALs muttered to his buddy, not bothering to lower his voice. "This isn't a job for someone her size." Sarah heard the comment but didn't react. She had heard worse throughout her military career. Growing up in Montana, she had spent countless winter nights hunting with her father. The cold was an old friend, not an enemy. Her small frame, which the men saw as a weakness, was actually an advantage. She needed less body heat to stay warm, and could fit into hiding spots that larger soldiers couldn't use. The helicopter pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. "Landing zone in sight. Intel reports Taliban forces have taken control of the village below. They're holding 37 civilians hostage, including women and children. Your job is to neutralize the threat and secure the area." Sarah looked out the window at the village nestled in the valley below. Smoke rose from several buildings, and she could see armed men moving between the structures. The mission briefing had been clear. A full Taliban battalion, roughly 400 fighters, had swept through the peaceful mountain village 3 days ago. They were using the civilians as human shields while they planned their next attack. The SEAL team leader, Commander Hayes, turned to address the group. "Martinez, you'll take the high ground on the North Ridge. The rest of us will move in from the south. Your job is to provide overwatch and eliminate any targets that threaten the team or the civilians." One of the younger SEALs, Johnson, shook his head. "Sir, that ridge is completely exposed. The wind up there will be brutal. Maybe Martinez should stay with the main team." Commander Hayes looked at Sarah. "What do you think, Martinez?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I can handle the cold, sir. The North Ridge gives me clear sight lines to the entire village. I can cover all your approach routes from there." The helicopter touched down on a small clearing about 2 miles from the village. As the team prepared to disembark, Sarah checked her equipment one final time. Her rifle was a custom-built precision weapon, designed for long-range shots in extreme conditions. She carried specialized cold-weather gear and enough ammunition for an extended engagement. The SEALs gathered their equipment and prepared to move out. Several of them glanced at Sarah with obvious concern. They weren't being cruel. They genuinely worried about her safety in these conditions. "Martinez," called out Petty Officer Rodriguez, one of the more experienced team members. "You sure about this? That ridge is going to be like an icebox." "We could find you another position." Sarah shouldered her pack and checked her rifle sling. "I appreciate the concern, Rodriguez, but I know what I'm doing. Just focus on your part of the mission." As the team moved out across the snowy terrain, Sarah split off toward the North Ridge, while the SEALs headed toward their southern approach. The snow crunched under her boots, but she moved with practiced silence. Years of hunting in similar conditions had taught her how to move through snow without making unnecessary noise. The climb to the ridge was steep and treacherous. Ice covered most of the rocks, making each step dangerous. Sarah's breath formed clouds in the frigid air, but she controlled her breathing to minimize the vapor. In sniper training, she had learned that even breath vapor could give away a position to enemy spotters. As she climbed higher, the wind grew stronger. It cut through her outer layers like a knife, but her body heat stayed regulated thanks to her specialized gear and her natural tolerance for cold. The SEALs below were probably struggling more than she was, despite their larger size and greater muscle mass. Halfway up the ridge, Sarah stopped to glass the village with her binoculars. She could see Taliban fighters moving between the buildings, but their positions weren't clear yet. She needed to reach her overwatch position before she could properly assess the situation. The final approach to her chosen position was the most challenging. Sarah had to crawl the last 100 yards on her belly, dragging her rifle and pack behind her. The snow soaked through her outer layer. But her body heat and the exertion kept her warm enough to function. Finally, she reached the perfect spot. A small outcropping of rocks that provided both cover and concealment, while offering clear sight lines to the village below. Sarah set up her rifle on its bipod and began scanning the area through her scope. What she saw made her blood run cold. The Taliban had positioned themselves much more strategically than the intelligence reports indicated. They had established overlapping fields of fire and had placed snipers in several key buildings. The SEAL team's planned approach would walk them directly into a killing field. Sarah keyed her radio. Overwatch to team leader. I have eyes on the village. The situation is worse than reported. Enemy has established prepared positions with interlocking fire. Your planned route is compromised. Commander Hayes' voice came back immediately. Copy, Overwatch. What do you see? Sarah began calling out enemy positions, using her scope to identify threats that would be invisible to the team moving through the valley. She counted at least 50 fighters in prepared positions, far more than expected for a small village raid. Team leader, they've turned this whole village into a fortress. They're using the civilians as human shields, but they've also prepared for a significant fight. This isn't a raid anymore. It's an ambush waiting to happen. The wind on the ridge picked up even more, and Sarah felt the cold starting to bite through her gear. But her training kicked in. She controlled her breathing, relaxed her muscles, and focused entirely on the task at hand. The SEALs below were counting on her eyes and her rifle to keep them alive. Through her scope, she spotted movement in the bell tower of the village mosque. A Taliban sniper was setting up his own rifle, preparing to engage the approaching SEAL team. Sarah made a quick calculation for wind, distance, and elevation. The shot was over 800 yards in brutal crosswind conditions. Most snipers would consider it nearly impossible. Sarah steadied her breathing, felt the rhythm of the wind, and squeezed the trigger. The Taliban sniper dropped immediately. Sarah had fired and eliminated the threat before the enemy even knew she was there. But now the real challenge began. She had revealed her position, and the entire Taliban battalion would soon be looking for her. Confirmed kill on enemy sniper, she radioed calmly. Enemy is now aware of Overwatch position. Team leader, you need to move fast before they reorganize. But as Sarah continued scanning the village, she realized the Taliban were better organized than anyone had imagined. They weren't just holding the village. They were using it as bait to draw American forces into a carefully prepared trap. The Taliban response was swift and coordinated. Within minutes of Sarah's first shot, enemy fighters began moving to new positions, while others started scanning the ridgeline for her location. Sarah watched through her scope as the enemy commander, easily identifiable by the way other fighters deferred to him, pointed toward the north ridge and began issuing orders. Team leader, they're repositioning to counter my Overwatch, Sarah radioed. I count at least 3 squads moving to flank my position. You need to accelerate your timeline. Commander Hayes' voice crackled back through the radio. Negative, Overwatch. We're still 40 minutes out from assault position. Can you relocate? Sarah scanned her surroundings quickly. The ridge was narrow with limited cover. Moving now would expose her to enemy observation and fire. More importantly, leaving her position would blind the SEAL team to enemy movements in the village. Negative on relocation. I have the best position for supporting your advance. I'll hold here and continue providing Overwatch. What Sarah didn't tell the team was that her position was about to become extremely dangerous. She had identified at least 12 enemy fighters moving up the backside of the ridge to hunt her down. The cold that the SEALs had worried about was now the least of her concerns. Through her scope, Sarah began tracking individual threats as they moved through the village. The Taliban fighters were disciplined and well-equipped. These weren't the usual insurgents. This was a trained military unit, using guerrilla tactics. She spotted another sniper taking position in a second-story window. Sarah adjusted for the wind, which had grown even stronger, and fired. The target dropped, but now muzzle flashes from the village indicated return fire. Bullets began striking the rocks near her position, taking effective fire from the village. Sarah reported calmly. Enemy has identified my general location, but not my exact position yet. The temperature on the ridge continued dropping as the sun moved behind the mountain peaks. Sarah's hands were starting to feel the cold despite her gloves, but she forced herself to maintain steady control of her rifle. Professional snipers trained for these exact conditions. Movement on her left caught her attention. 3 Taliban fighters had made it nearly halfway up the ridge and were moving toward her position using cover and concealment. Sarah made a quick decision. She couldn't engage them without exposing herself to the fighters in the village, but she couldn't let them get close enough to assault her position either. Sarah keyed her radio again. Team leader, I have enemy forces climbing to my position from the west. Approximately squad-sized element, armed with assault rifles, and at least 1 rocket-propelled grenade. Copy. Overwatch. We're moving as fast as we can. Hold position if possible. Sarah knew, if possible, was military speak for, you're on your own. The SEAL team was still too far away to provide any assistance. She would have to handle the approaching threat by herself. She tracked the lead climber through her scope. He was moving carefully, using the terrain to mask his approach. Sarah estimated he would reach her position in less than 10 minutes. The other 2 fighters were spreading out to attack from different angles. In the village below, Sarah spotted the Taliban commander again. He was directing his forces with hand signals while staying behind cover. Taking him out would disrupt their coordination, but the shot was extremely difficult. He was partially concealed behind a stone wall, and the wind conditions made precise shooting nearly impossible. Sarah made another quick calculation. If she could eliminate the commander, the Taliban forces might lose their cohesion long enough for the SEAL team to reach their assault position. It was a risk, but the alternative was letting the enemy maintain their organized defense. She adjusted her scope for the extreme range and wind conditions. The shot was over 900 yards through shifting crosswinds. Sarah controlled her breathing and found her natural respiratory pause. At the moment between heartbeats, when her body was perfectly still, she squeezed the trigger. The commander dropped immediately. Sarah watched through her scope as the Taliban fighters in the village began showing signs of confusion. Several looked toward where their leader had been standing, unsure of what had happened. But the shot had also revealed her exact position to the fighters climbing the ridge. Sarah heard shouting in Pashto coming from below and to her left. They were coordinating their final approach. Sarah quickly shifted her position, moving 15 yards to a secondary spot she had identified earlier. It wasn't as good for supporting the SEAL team, but it gave her better protection from the approaching Taliban fighters. The first enemy fighter appeared at the edge of her original position. Sarah held her fire, watching as he signaled to his companions that the position was empty. They thought she had retreated down the backside of the ridge. Sarah waited until all 3 fighters were exposed, searching the area where they thought she had been hiding. Then she engaged with her sidearm, a suppressed pistol that was more appropriate for close-range combat. 2 of the fighters dropped immediately. The third took cover behind a boulder and began firing in her direction with his assault rifle. Sarah stayed low, waiting for her opportunity. The surviving fighter made a tactical mistake. Instead of staying in cover and calling for reinforcements, he tried to advance on what he thought was Sarah's position. She caught him moving between rocks and eliminated him with a single shot. 3 enemy fighters neutralized on the ridge, Sarah radioed. Village commander is also down. Enemy forces in the village appear disorganized. Commander Hayes's voice came back with obvious relief. Outstanding work. Overwatch. We're in position and beginning our assault in 5 minutes. Continue providing cover fire as able. Sarah moved back to her original position, which still offered the best fields of fire for supporting the SEAL assault. The wind had died down slightly, improving her shooting conditions. Through her scope, she could see Taliban fighters trying to reorganize in the village below. The SEALs began their assault just as the sun disappeared completely behind the mountains. Sarah watched through her night vision scope as the team moved with perfect coordination through the village outskirts. Years of training together showed in every movement, but the Taliban had one more surprise waiting. As the SEAL team approached the first building, Sarah spotted movement on rooftops throughout the village. The enemy had positioned fighters on nearly every building, creating multiple elevated firing positions. Team leader, you have enemy on the rooftops, Sarah warned. Multiple shooters with elevated positions covering your approach routes. Copy, Overwatch. We see them. Can you provide suppressive fire? Sarah began engaging targets on the rooftops, forcing the Taliban fighters to take cover instead of firing down at the advancing SEALs. Her position on the ridge gave her clear shots at enemies who thought they were safely concealed from ground-level assault. One by one, Sarah eliminated threats that the SEAL team couldn't even see. Her rifle cracked repeatedly in the cold mountain air, each shot precisely placed to maximum effect. The Taliban fighters began abandoning their rooftop positions, which allowed the SEALs to advance more quickly. But Sarah's ammunition was running low, and more enemy fighters were moving through the village. The battle was far from over, and the most dangerous phase was just beginning. As the SEAL team fought house to house through the village, Sarah realized the Taliban had prepared for a much larger battle than anyone expected. Fresh fighters kept appearing from hidden positions, and organized resistance continued despite the loss of their commander. Through her scope, Sarah spotted something that changed everything. A large group of Taliban fighters was moving through a ravine on the far side of the village. Completely hidden from the SEAL team's view, they were positioning themselves to surround and cut off the American forces. Team leader, you have a major problem, Sarah radioed urgently. Large enemy force, approximately company strength, maneuvering to your 6 o'clock. They're using the eastern ravine to stay out of sight. Commander Hayes's voice came back tense. How large are we talking, Overwatch? Sarah did a quick count through her scope. At least 100 fighters, possibly more. They're armed with heavy weapons and moving to cut off your withdrawal route. The situation was becoming desperate. The SEAL team was designed for quick strikes, not sustained combat against superior numbers. They were already engaged with enemies in the village and couldn't break contact to deal with the flanking force. Sarah made a decision that went against every rule of sniper employment. Instead of staying in her Overwatch position, she was going to leave the ridge and intercept the flanking force herself. Team leader. I'm moving from Overwatch position to engage the flanking force. Negative, Overwatch. You cannot engage that many enemies alone. Return to base camp and call for reinforcement. Sarah was already packing her rifle and preparing to move. Sir, by the time reinforcements arrive, your team will be overrun. I can delay the flanking force long enough for you to complete the mission and withdraw. She didn't wait for permission. Sarah began moving down the backside of the ridge, using a route that would put her between the Taliban flanking force and the SEAL team. The descent was treacherous in the dark, but she moved quickly and silently. The ravine where the Taliban force was moving was narrow and steep-sided. Sarah realized she could use the terrain to her advantage. Instead of trying to fight the entire force directly, she could create a choke point and force them to advance through killing ground of her choosing. Sarah reached the mouth of the ravine just as the first Taliban fighters emerged. She had beaten them there by less than 5 minutes. Working quickly, she found a position among the rocks that would let her engage targets as they exited the ravine while staying concealed from return fire. The first enemy fighters appeared cautiously at the ravine mouth. They were moving tactically, checking for threats before advancing. Sarah let them pass, waiting for more targets to present themselves. When a group of 6 fighters emerged together, Sarah opened fire. Her first shot dropped the lead fighter, and the others immediately took cover. But they were trapped in the open ground between the ravine and the village, exactly where Sarah wanted them. What happened next amazed even Sarah. Instead of pressing their advance or falling back into the ravine, the Taliban force began deploying into defensive positions. They thought they were under attack by a much larger American force. Sarah continued engaging targets of opportunity, moving between firing positions to create the impression of multiple shooters. The Taliban fighters began calling for support from their forces in the village, which meant fewer enemies for the SEAL team to face. Overwatch to team leader, Sarah radioed between shots. The flanking force has stopped their advance and gone defensive. I've got them pinned in the open ground east of your position. How the hell did you stop an entire company? Commander Hayes asked. I convinced them they're facing more opposition than they actually are, Sarah replied, firing another shot. But I can't hold this position much longer. They're starting to figure out there's only one of me. Sarah was right. The Taliban fighters were becoming more aggressive, and several were maneuvering to flank her position. She had maybe 10 minutes before they would overwhelm her through sheer numbers. In the village, the SEAL team was making rapid progress. With the flanking force neutralized, they could focus entirely on clearing the buildings and securing the civilians. Sarah watched through her scope as her teammates moved with deadly efficiency from house to house. But her own situation was deteriorating rapidly. Taliban fighters were advancing on her position from 3 directions, and she was running critically low on ammunition. Sarah made the decision to withdraw to a secondary position, but as she moved, enemy fighters spotted her. Automatic weapon fire erupted around Sarah's position. Bullets struck the rocks near her head, showering her with stone fragments. She rolled behind a larger boulder and assessed her situation. At least 20 enemy fighters had her position surrounded. Sarah keyed her radio one last time. Team leader, be advised I am surrounded and heavily engaged. Complete your mission and withdraw. Do not attempt rescue. Negative. Overwatch. We're coming to get you. That's an order, sir. Don't compromise the mission for one person. Sarah knew the SEAL team would never abandon her. But she also knew they couldn't save her without risking the entire operation and the civilian hostages. She had to find her own way out. Looking at her tactical situation, Sarah realized she had one advantage the enemy didn't expect. They assumed she would try to fight her way out or call for backup. Instead, Sarah decided to do something completely unexpected. She began moving toward the enemy positions, using the darkness and terrain to stay concealed. The Taliban fighters were focused on the position where they had last seen her, not expecting her to advance directly toward them. Sarah worked her way behind the closest group of enemy fighters. They were positioned in a small depression, focused entirely on suppressing her last known location. Sarah eliminated 3 of them with her sidearm before the others realized what was happening. The surviving fighters in that position began firing wildly in all directions, not sure where the attack was coming from. This created chaos among the other Taliban positions, which began firing at each other in the confusion. Sarah used the confusion to break contact and move toward another enemy position. The Taliban fighters were now completely disorganized, unsure of how many Americans they were facing or where the attacks were coming from. Within 30 minutes, Sarah had eliminated or scattered the entire flanking force. Most of the surviving Taliban fighters were retreating back through the ravine, convinced they were facing a much larger American unit. Team leader, flanking force has been neutralized and is in full retreat, Sarah radioed. Area is clear for your withdrawal. Commander Hayes's voice came back with obvious amazement. Overwatch. How did you engage an entire company and survive? Sarah was already moving toward the village to rejoin the team. Sir, sometimes the best way to handle superior numbers is to make them think they're facing even more superior numbers. The SEAL team had successfully secured the village and rescued all 37 civilian hostages. As they prepared for extraction, the team members looked at Sarah with a new level of respect. Petty Officer Rodriguez approached her as they waited for the extraction helicopter. Martinez, I owe you an apology. When we said you'd freeze up there, we were wrong about everything. Sarah smiled as she cleaned her rifle. Rodriguez, I didn't freeze up there. I heated things up. Commander Hayes conducted a quick after-action review with the team. Martinez, your actions tonight were extraordinary. You not only provided overwatch for the team, but you single-handedly defeated a flanking force that would have overrun our position. Johnson, the young SEAL who had questioned her ability to handle the cold, shook his head in amazement. I've never seen anything like that. You outflanked an entire battalion. Sarah looked back at the ridge where she had spent hours in sub-freezing temperatures, providing cover for her team. The cold that everyone had worried about had been the least of the challenges she faced. The extraction helicopter arrived just as dawn broke over the mountains. As the team loaded the rescued civilians and prepared to depart, Sarah took one last look at the village below. The mission had been successful, but it had required every skill she had learned in years of training. During the flight back to base, Commander Hayes approached Sarah. Martinez, I'm recommending you for the Silver Star. What you did tonight was above and beyond anything we could have expected. Sarah nodded her thanks but was already thinking about the next mission. She had proven herself to her teammates and to herself. The doubts about her ability to handle extreme conditions and high-stress situations had been answered definitively. As the helicopter flew over the Afghan mountains, Sarah realized that the SEAL's initial concern about her freezing had been completely wrong. She hadn't frozen at all. Instead, she had stayed calm, focused, and deadly effective under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The woman sniper who the SEALs thought would freeze on the ridge had instead outmaneuvered and outfought an entire Taliban battalion. She had proven that skill, training, and determination mattered far more than physical size or gender assumptions. When they landed at the base, word of the mission's success had already spread. Sarah Martinez had become a legend among the special operations community, not because she was a woman who had succeeded in a man's world, but because she was a warrior who had excelled when her country needed her most. The mission report would eventually become required reading at sniper schools and special operations training centers. But for Sarah, it was simply another day of doing the job she loved, serving alongside the best soldiers in the world, and proving that determination and skill always overcome doubt and prejudice.